EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. School is back in session across the country, and that includes many institutions of higher education and post-secondary studies. We decided to come up with a few story ideas to help you get back into the groove of the beat as the new year gets underway. And joining us to help out is Sarah Brown. She is a daily beat reporter for the Chronicle of Higher Education, covering student life, campus racial tensions, sexual assault and harassment, and state higher education policy. Sarah, thanks for making time for us.
Thanks for having me, Emily.
So I asked you to come up with a few story ideas, and I want to jump right into them. The first one you wanted to discuss was related to Greek life and fraternities. Tell us about that.
Right. So Greek life is one of those story ideas that's always kind of got news going on in higher ed. Hazing is obviously a huge problem, and you probably are aware that there have been a number of student deaths, high-profile ones in recent years related to fraternity parties, hazing. So a lot of the parents of these students who have died are speaking out. So there's more pressure on colleges to take significant action and actually be transparent about the problems in fraternities and what they're doing about them. This is an opportunity for, it's the start of the year, and freshmen are obviously considering joining fraternities. And so if you've got Greek life on campuses in your region, this is a great time to kind of dig into sort of what's going on this academic year, how universities are actually cracking down on them or spotting problems in fraternities. It's a good time to think about what kinds of records you might want to be requesting. So in some states, you can get disciplinary reports for fraternity investigations. You can obviously get police reports involving fraternities, fraternity scorecards, actually posting online data about fraternities. It's becoming more common because people are sort of putting pressure on institutions to be more transparent about all this stuff. You can look and see if your institution does have Greek life and see if they are posting these sort of scorecards. They'll talk about GPA of members of fraternities and sororities as well, how much community service they're doing, how much money they're actually raising, how many disciplinary violations they've had or been dinged for. And so you can really get a good picture of sort of what's happening on your campus. And I dug into one of these scorecards once. It was at Penn State. And just the levels of fundraising, it was actually really striking because a lot of times fraternity supporters will talk about how, these are, community service organizations. We do a lot of philanthropy. And some of the fraternities had less than 1 hour for the entire academic year of community service on average per member, and like $5 of philanthropy. So it can be pretty revealing if you'd start digging into those numbers.
Well, Sarah, I wasn't a math major, but that doesn't sound like a lot.
Exactly. I mean, one of the fraternities, the only thing they had under the philanthropy in terms of dollars was like a dozen bags of toys. Like that was it. I mean, that was the only thing they'd done all year. It's not great. And the last thing I'll just mention quickly is that because universities are cracking down on these fraternities, it's actually starting to push a number of them underground outside of administrative oversight. That's obviously a big problem because if administrators don't know what's going on, they can't crack down on the problems. And so there have been a number of university presidents I've seen warning parents and students, like, don't join these underground organizations. They totally operate outside of university oversight, and that can be really dangerous for students. And because there's this sort of crackdown happening and more pressure on colleges to take more action when there are problems in fraternities like hazing and sexual misconduct and that kind of thing, it is pushing some fraternities to go underground. And so that's definitely an issue I would keep an eye on because it seems to be a pretty live thing in the Greek life space.
I think it's a good time in the fall when the school year is starting. I mean, theoretically, before there's necessarily an incident or an event on a reporter's radar that necessitates focusing on the fraternities, to sort of talk about some of these big picture issues. I mean, for example, where do colleges and universities' responsibilities lie when it comes to regulation and oversight? I mean, a lot of campuses will take a sort of hands-off approach and say, there's an independent Greek council that's supposed to oversee these things. But the fact is that colleges and universities are the pipelines for these recruits. These fraternities and sororities literally wouldn't exist without those students first gaining admission to that college or university.
Exactly. And I think there's a lot more pressure on universities these days to actually take more responsibility for what's happening in the fraternities. I think in the past, and this still is somewhat the case, where they'll sort of say, well, these are private organizations, like they're affiliated with us in some way, shape, or form, but they operate pretty independently. They're self-policing. That's kind of part the self-policing model where the fraternity council sort of runs the investigations of disciplinary violations but that's sort of a pretty consistent line from the universities. But I don't know if I think that argument is holding less water in this day and age, right? I mean, when students die very preventable deaths at fraternity events and because of hazing, that's really putting the pressure on universities to say, well, these are our students, we need to step in here. And so it's interesting. But yeah, I agree. This is the time of year to really get a handle on where are the issues? Are there problem fraternities? What kinds of data can you get a hold of? And that really puts you in a good position, I think, for the academic year.
And I think, it's also important to talk to some students who are active in Greek life to find out why they've joined, why it was important to them, what they're getting out of it, and also to look at some of the student-led challenges to Greek life. There was a sit-in at Swarthmore College last April, which actually led to two fraternities disbanding. I mean, that was pretty remarkable.
It was. And I think that's a great point because one thing that you can do later in the fall is just get a sense of like how much participation there is and has it gone up? Because on the national level, the recent trends have been that fraternity participation has actually gone up pretty consistently in recent years, which is interesting given how much negative news attention they've gotten. So, what is drawing students to Greek life? What kind of experience are they hoping to get out of it? And, saying fraternities all just haze people, it's kind of painting with a broad brush. And so there's a lot of nuance there. There are fraternities that serve very different purposes. There are fraternities that are maybe trying to create very intentional like community service spaces or spaces for leadership development and that kind of thing. And it's a good time to dig in and maybe see if you can localize some of that national data about more students are participating in Greek life and see what's happening in your region.
Well, that dovetails nicely with another story idea you want to talk about, and that's how to bring students together versus separating them apart, especially when they have different backgrounds. Let's jump into that.
Right. So, it's fair to say, regardless of your politics, it's clear that society as a whole has become more polarized in recent years. And one thing I hear a lot among folks in higher ed is, how can universities play a role in teaching students to have thoughtful, productive conversations across difference and create spaces for that to happen. I think people see universities, these centers for knowledge and for intellectual debate as having a particular role to play in creating better public discourse. And from the reporting that I've done and that some of my colleagues have done, we can tell that this is on the minds of a number of professors as well as administrators. They're trying to figure out how to have difficult conversations in their classrooms and outside of the classroom as well, whether it's through, holding dinner events with folks from different backgrounds and encouraging them to just have conversations. And so I would start with, some of your professor sources on campus. Maybe you have a center for teaching and learning at one of your institutions. See who's thinking about how to sort of create spaces to have productive conversations across difference. And it doesn't have to be, again, inside of the classroom. It can be these various programs, speaker events, dinners. My sense in talking to folks on campuses is that they're really trying to figure out, we're ramping up into the 2020 election. And obviously, there's going to be a lot of national political discussion, and it's going to affect what students are talking about on campuses. And so, given the tenor of some of those conversations, you have obviously a lot of really strong rhetoric from President Trump, as well as some of the Democratic congresswomen who he's actually been targeting and calling out. There's just a lot of really heightened emotions and tensions in terms of the national discussion. And I think it does affect how some students are talking about these issues, right? And so I think universities are really trying to figure out what is our role in all of this. And I think this is a great time for you to dig in and see what's happening in your region.
Well, President Trump recently signed an executive order that suggested campuses that violated free speech laws would risk their federal funding. What have you seen as the response to that among higher education leadership?
Well, a lot of institutions, when the free speech executive order came out, said, especially at public universities, we have to abide by the First Amendment. None of this is particularly new for us. We do allow free speech, yada, yada, yada. It's kind of a typical response. There's obviously been a lot of conversation about whether colleges allow free speech, and usually colleges push back and say, yes, we absolutely do. But I think there certainly are some people who say there are, for example, far more liberal faculty members than conservative faculty members, right? And so what does that mean for our, more conservative students, and creating spaces to make sure that they feel like they can talk about their views openly and whatnot? The research does not show that colleges suppress conservative speech in any particular way, or, give conservative students worse grades. The research does not hold up there. However, I think there are a lot of people who say we need to be careful here, right? And especially the 2016 election was, I think, a reckoning in some ways for college campuses, because it was sort of this moment where they said, oh, we are not in touch with wide swaths of America. We assumed that President Trump would not be elected, and we didn't see it coming. And I think some of that reckoning is going to play out in the next academic year, right? And sort of the thinking about our space as sort of an elite, somewhat privileged, educated space. And then there's, a whole bunch of people who aren't in the same mindset as the folks on college campuses. And so I think that's something that's going to be a really big issue this year, because the election is really going to start heating up.
One thing I've noticed, it seems like there are more campuses that instead of necessarily turning away a provocative speaker, are using that as an opportunity for counter programming and scheduling things like discussion groups and workshops and even campus debates at the same time as that potentially offensive programming.
Controversial speakers on campus is obviously still a very big issue, and that kind of inspired President Trump's executive order in some ways. But around the time that there were some real provocateurs coming onto campuses, people like Milo Yiannopoulos and the white supremacist Richard Spencer, there were universities, especially public universities, said, we have to allow these folks onto campuses. We can't deny, we're public space, and we can't, deny them. However, how do we sort of handle this appropriately? How do we make sure that our students are safe, and make sure that, quite frankly, students just don't go to the event? I remember Michigan State got a request from Richard Spencer to speak, and they said, okay, well, we have to allow him, but we're going to put him way far away from the heart of campus. They put him in like the agricultural pavilion, which is like a good mile from the center of campus. Still technically on campus, but kind of in the middle of farmland. And they scheduled it during a time of year around spring break when no students were around. And that was another way that they sort of handled a real provocateur who they didn't feel had any academic value coming to campus. So universities are navigating a lot of interesting issues here. There's other issues. President Trump, while he's campaigning, is obviously going to go speak on college campuses. That's a very typical campaign stop for presidential candidates. And when he went to East Carolina just recently, there was a ton of student anger about why would you allow him to speak? And quite frankly, ECU says we had to. We're a public university. But at the same time, we need to sort of think through how to handle these cases in sort of a way that makes sense, right? What kind of other programming can we do? How can we create spaces for students to talk through what it means to have a chant at President Trump's rally that says "send her back" on campus? And yet there are a lot of Trump supporting students. What do they think about all this?
We're talking with Sarah Brown of the Chronicle of Higher Education about hot stories to consider as the new academic year gets underway. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you for taking a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us grow. Be sure to check your podcast queue for our recent episode looking at K-12 back-to-school story ideas as well. Sarah, we couldn't talk about back-to-school story ideas without talking about the big idea that is on everyone's minds right now, especially if you are a Democratic presidential candidate, and that's student debt, how to fix it. What should we know?
Of course, this is a huge issue in the 2020 election. And I think for all us higher ed nerds, it's actually really exciting because education isn't always a huge player in the national political conversation during presidential elections. But this year, it absolutely is. You've got Elizabeth Warren wanting to cancel student debt for billions of Americans. You've got Bernie Sanders wanting to cancel literally all student debt. And you have multiple candidates making various proposals for 2-year free college and 4-year college being free at public institutions. So there's obviously a lot of national conversation about what proposals make sense. So there's been a lot of national political reporting, but you're on the ground. You're the one, as a local journalist, really talking to students on a regular basis. Also, early polls, don't trust polls, but they do suggest that for the 18 to 34-year-old demographic, student loans are a top voting issue for them. So this is a big deal, right? I think this is a chance for folks doing local reporting to just figure out what students in your area actually think of all these plans. It's easy to think, oh, if a student heard that a candidate wanted to cancel all student debt and make all college free, that they would just latch on to that plan. Why wouldn't they want that? But I'm sure it's more complicated than that, right? Finding some smart students to interview could be very revealing. And you can ask them a range of questions. You can ask what they think would be most helpful to them, what kinds of questions they want to ask candidates about student debt. You can ask what kinds of financial aid they themselves have. Is it grants? Is it loans? Is it federal aid? Is it state aid? Just kind of breaking down that whole space of complex financial aid policy. How many people in their family are on the hook for their loans? How much debt they expect to graduate with? There's so many ways that you can tease out some of the threads of financial aid, student loans, student debt in a way that I think would be really revealing. Also, this is a chance for you to put student debt in your region in context. I think because there's tons of data on this, right? What are student debt levels at your institutions on average? What are the default rates on loans? This kind of data is available at the federal level. That's what the IPEDS database is for. And so that's kind of a timely and also timeless story. Like, what is the broader context in your particular region around student loans and student debt?
While we're talking about digging into the data, I encourage reporters to look at the percentage of students in their areas that are non-traditional, and they are certainly contributing to some of those heavy student debt loads. For example, adult students, which are students ages 24 and older, who may have gone back to school after being laid off during the recession or looking for retraining, or perhaps just want to finish a degree that they never completed when they were younger. They're a big part of that equation.
I think that's a great point. And I think it's sort of a reminder, yet again, that a huge percentage of students are not the traditional 18 to 22-year-old residential students that we all sort of frankly talk about in our conversations about higher ed. And a lot of higher ed policy, quite frankly, is made thinking about those students. But an enormous percentage of students are part-time, older, working, have kids, have families, have other obligations outside of institutions. They don't live on campus. And just keeping that in mind with your coverage and when you're asking questions about policies and changes and how they're going to affect your institutions, I think it's really important to keep that in mind.
I'd also put on my public editor hat and just remind folks to be careful with definitions, including when you talk about some of these presidential candidate plans. Free tuition does not mean a free college experience, and it also doesn't necessarily address a lot of the underlying issues that cause so many young people to drop out, things like food and housing insecurity. So, just be mindful of those definitions as you write about these very, very important stories.
Yeah. And I also would encourage folks, because free college is this sort of overarching phrase that encompasses a lot of different kinds of policies. And they're actually on a more local level, both state and local. There are a lot of conversations happening about affordability that might not have the label free college, but they're probably really interesting. I can think of a couple of institutions that are looking really carefully at increase Pell Grants and sort of targeting Pell Grant recipients, very low income students who really can't afford much of any tuition or fees, and trying to figure out ways to really make sure those students are not drowning in student debt at the end of their educations. And there are a number of states that are just experimenting with different kinds of affordability policies, whether or not it's completely free college. So, in North Carolina, for example, there are a couple of universities that have $500 per semester tuition. And that's kind of an experiment to see, does that increase enrollment? What does that mean for graduation and completion rates? All that kind of stuff. And so there's a lot of college affordability conversations happening at a local level. And I'd encourage you to not just get lost in all the presidential discussion about this free college proposal and that free college proposal, when really, like, college affordability is a very individual and local issue. And you can really dig into the local context there.
If you're looking for even more stories on the higher ed beat, I suggest you drop on over at ewa.org and look for Inside Higher Ed, Scott Jasik's annual cheat sheet of the top stories to watch in the coming academic year. This is one of the most popular sessions at EWA's annual national seminar. If you weren't able to join us in Baltimore this spring, this is a great time to catch up. Sarah, you've shared some great story ideas. I don't want to let you go without asking for some tips on how to manage some of the day-to-day aspects of the beat. For example, what are some ways to get to know your campus community a little better?
So this is a great time sort of at the start of the year. If there are a couple of topics that you're planning to focus on this academic year, whether it's diversity and inclusion or affordability, you've got your financial aid office, you've got your enrollment folks for academic issues, you've got the provost office, you've got various deans and folks in academic affairs. There's so many people on college campuses that it'd be good for you to start sourcing with. And of course, faculty senates are a great place to look for sources, because faculty senates, they want to be involved with the decision making of the university. And in our experience and our reporting, they often feel like they're shut out. And at the same time, they tend to be very plugged into sort of what's going on. And so this is a great time to sit down with your faculty senate chair. Also, boards of trustees, or whatever your board happens to be called. This is a great time to make sure that you are up to speed on your sourcing on the boards, because the boards, they know exactly what's going on and they make a lot of the big time decisions. And so getting sources on your board and just sitting down and talking to them about what their priorities are, that's often really, really important. So I'd certainly suggest all of the above on that front. In addition to that, there are a couple of reports that you can keep in mind, just like that happen at the K-12 level. There tend to be sort of standardized test scores and that kind of thing. On the college level, so you've got, first off, your campus security reports, your Clery reports, which are annual. They have statistics on campus crimes, including breakdowns of various sex crimes like stalking, domestic violence, sexual assault. Those are a great source of information, and colleges have been required to expand their Clery reporting for the past 5 years or so in terms of breaking down the different domestic violence, stalking, those kinds of crimes. So you can definitely keep an eye on those. Related note, the Title IX regulations on sexual assault should be dropping this fall. So definitely keep an eye out for those. In addition to that, I was talking about IPEDS data. There's a ton of IPEDS data that has to be reported every single year. Enrollment is a big one. So enrollment data has to be reported in the fall and also updated in the spring. But you have to report your enrollment data a couple of weeks into the academic year. So what are the trends in your region? Which colleges are struggling with enrollment? Which ones are growing? What's driving all of that? That's another thing that you can keep an eye on, because colleges do have to report updated numbers every year. The only other thing that I would mention is there are a lot of higher education associations out there that issue regular reports on a whole range of topics. So the American Council on Education will often issue reports on things like trends in race and ethnicity and graduation, and how students are doing from certain demographic groups. The American Association of State Colleges and Universities does great reports on trends in what's going on at the state level, what kinds of laws seem to be a trend, what are state legislators doing in the higher ed space. Another group called Coupa HR will do an annual report about national faculty and staff, higher education professional data. And so you can get a ton of good information from there about demographics, salaries, all that kind of stuff. And so there are a number of great higher education associations that you can look at and try to localize some of the reports that they put out. Definitely keep an eye out for all of those as they drop.
Sarah, I've learned a ton of things to be watching out for in the higher ed beat. I really appreciate you making time for the EWA Radio podcast.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Emily.
Sarah Brown is a daily beat reporter for the Chronicle of Higher Education and joined us from her office in Washington, D.C. And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line, radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, a terrific back-to-school season, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for listening.